This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Okay, so today we are back with a midsummer episode, which we haven't been doing a lot of because we're technically off, but we're political, so we can't really be off. So we've decided to come together for a new panel that we're calling the Progressive Passport Panel. And the whole point of it is analyzing the progressive people and ideas that are changing politics around the world. Usually we focus on Canada and maybe the provinces, but we want to extend our focus to progressive politics worldwide. And we want to talk about what Canadian leaders can actually learn from our global partners in progress. That's a nice sentence. So today's episode, we're actually going to be focusing on the UK. They obviously have a new prime minister who's been in there for a few weeks at this point. He's come up with a 10-year plan to get Britain back on track in the aftermath of Brexit and what he calls 40 years of deindustrialization, privatization, and austerity, which, heck yes, fully agree, sir. So that's going to be the focus of today's episode, but in future episodes, we're going to focus on other people and places. If anyone listens to our podcast, they know about Alex's obsession with Mamdani. So we're definitely going to do an episode on him at some point. Maybe we'll get over to Spain. There are many different options for us to talk about because there are progressive governments and parties across the world who are doing interesting things that we can learn from. Before we dive into all of this, though, we want to introduce our panel so you have a sense of who they are before we start talking. And we're going to kick things off with Blue Knox. Blue.
Hello. So I'm Blue. The two of you know me, but for anybody watching, I'm a public affairs and communications executive. I've been very fortunate to work as director of communications at several levels of government, including for Toronto Mayor John Tory, Canada's Minister of Trade. And I think might be more relevant for this podcast in particular is that I've been very fortunate to work in a few countries around the world in the nonprofit sector, from Cambodia to the United States. So really excited to tackle this with you guys.
Alex?
And I'm Alex Mather. I spent some time in U.S. politics working for Blue State, which was previously called Blue State Digital, which ran the communications fundraising and grassroots activation on President Obama's campaigns. And there we also did a bunch of international work with UK Labour, Australian Labour, some stuff in Spain and France and elsewhere as well. After that, I was a senior advisor to the Premier of Ontario, previous Premier of Ontario, and now I build affordable housing for a living.
And I am, of course, your trusty podcast host, Teresa Lubowitz, back for yet another panel. Obviously, my experience is more on this side of the border. I have worked in communications and fundraising and digital and a number of different things for the Ontario Liberal Party, also in the government of Ontario and for the Premier of Ontario. But I do have a very keen interest in international affairs. There was at one point a potential of me studying that in university. And then, I went the easier route with philosophy because you didn't have to do any math or language training there. But I do maintain that interest. Now, I was in 2016, I was at the DNC convention that nominated Hillary Clinton. And then obviously got a front row seat to the beginning of America's decline there. And then when I was in Australia for a month, it was actually the decline of the Liberal government there that has now led to their current progressive Labour government that they have in Australia. And shortly I will be going to the UK to see Andy Burnham's government up close and personal. So all three of us have a really keen interest in international affairs and the progressive politics that are possible in other countries and what that means for us here. So hence was born this panel, and that's what we're going to be focusing on going forward. So today's episode is about the new UK Prime Minister. So for those who don't know, I'm going to give a bit of a rundown because Andy Burnham has been around for quite a long time, but I think some Canadians may not know that much about him. He was born in Liverpool in 1970. Those who know me a bit better than perhaps the podcast audience will know that I watch a lot of Liverpool FC. So he's actually not a fan of them. He's a fan of their rival in Liverpool, but we'll forgive him that. But Liverpool is really important, I think, to his political character and how he's developed as a politician. So maybe we'll dive a bit into that. His parents telephone engineer, medical receptionist, nothing really fancy in terms of, what you often see in UK politicians. Raised Catholic. I saw on a podcast today that they think he might be the first Catholic prime minister of the UK. Technically, Boris Johnson was, but as Andy pointed out, he was baptized, but he didn't really do anything. He didn't learn the catechism, if you will. That's a note from my very Catholic parents. Andy joined the Labour Party at 15. He's also a member of the Cooperative Party, which makes him actually the first prime minister of the UK who's a member of that party as well. You can have a number of different memberships politically in the UK, which is a little different than in Canada. Studied English at Cambridge. It was suggested he might have been the first prime minister to study that. He doubted that. I agree with him. That's probably not true. He has a master's of arts. In the 90s, he worked as a journalist for a trade publication, which, some people look down on, but other people see a lot of value in those publications. This one was called Tank Container World, which is one of my favorite facts about him. Ahead of the 1997 Labour victory, which obviously we paid a lot of attention to over in Canada as well. He was a researcher for a Labour MP. That was his entry point into politics at the professional level. He served in a number of staffer roles until 2001 when he was 31 years old, and then he ran for office in the Greater Manchester area, which is where he grew up in. And he served as an MP from 2001 to 2017. He served in cabinet under Blair and Brown, the two Labour prime ministers in recent memory, and he had a key role as the health secretary, which is something that's going to come back up as he pursues his own agenda as prime minister. There's a number of more details we can go into, but two key points in more recent history for him are that he ran for Labour leader twice before, actually, in 2010 and in 2015. And his slogans were aspirational socialism and rediscover the beating heart of Labour. So you can get a sense of his progressive politics as compared to some other folks in his party. He lost both of those races to Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn, and then eventually left federal politics to become the mayor of Greater Manchester in 2017, re-elected in 2021 and 2024, so obviously a popular politician locally. As mayor, he focused on combating homelessness, deprivatizing transit. These were really big issues for him, and he has focused on them already as prime minister. His current position was actually really sparked in the last year. He was hoping to run in a by-election in early 2026 and was blocked by his own party from running in that by-election. That didn't hold him off, of course. I always find when politicians try to keep another politician at bay, that rarely works out for them. He ended up running in a by-election instead after the MP for Makerfield resigned so that he could run in that by-election. He was approved that time and then joined the Labour caucus and almost immediately essentially became the de facto next prime minister and was largely his supporters largely pushed out the sitting prime minister who had won a whopping majority but was deeply unpopular, which is, of course, Keir Starmer. He had support from 90% of the Labour caucus, which basically prevented in the Labour Party's rules anyone else challenging for the role, and became the de facto prime minister pretty much as soon as he had become an MP again. So he's got a very interesting philosophy when it comes to politics, and we're going to take a little look at that. But the first question for our panel is really
wait, Teresa, did you include the Oasis piece?
I didn't. Do you want me to talk
about it? You got to say it.
So yes, this is important. So during his by-election campaign, he actually started using an Oasis song, and the band actually approved his use of it, which I guess speaks to how cool he is as a politician. So as we know, Oasis doesn't agree on anything or with each other even. So getting approval for them to use a song is a pretty big deal, actually. Maybe he'll solve world peace next after he solved the Oasis brothers. But so that's sort of where he has been recently. But he's had a really rapid rise to power. It's technically rapid. I mean, it's been going on for 30 years, but this last little bit has been very, very rapid. He's not a new face in UK politics by any means. And he served in pretty much every possible political capacity you can in the UK over the last 30 years, and of course failed to win the Labour leadership twice. So the question to our panel is, why has he caught fire now? And we'll start with Alex.
Yeah, I mean, for starters, to set the stage a little bit, it's worth noting just how strange a situation this is. I mean, Keir Starmer won this term of parliament, or Labour under his leadership won this term of parliament, they have 407 seats in the House right now. The Tories have the next most at 119, but in a fairly rapid period of time, Starmer's popularity went down to a net approval of -40. Like he was less popular, I think, than Trump, who is of course very unpopular in most of the UK. And when all this was going on, to Teresa's point, Burnham wasn't even in Parliament. He was the mayor of Manchester and was very, very popular. But I think that's sort of where you have to start, because that's instructive in terms of how he's positioned himself early on. He's not selling left versus right. He's not even really selling insider versus outsider. I would argue he's selling, the notion that government can work for people again. He said that and versions of that repeatedly, and acknowledging that it has stopped working for most people. And that's really what his whole campaign for leadership was based on, 3 weeks long as it was. But he's trying to answer a question that he reckons a number of people are asking right now, which is, can democratic governments still build things? Can they still solve things? Can they still be a force for good in people's lives? And the other thing you have to look at is where Britain's been over the last decade or so. In some ways, Teresa, we were talking about this the other day, Britain was a little bit the leading edge of the sword on some of the MAGA, populist rise of the populist right. Brexit happened before Trump won the White House. People, I think, forget. And, it showed not just how an anti-establishment message can defeat one political party, but almost the entire political establishment. Burnham is, I think, what's the number? 7th prime minister in the last 5 years, something to that effect. Since Brexit, so just since 2016, it's Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and then also Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader at that point. And with the exception, I guess, of Sunak, all of those were either populist upstarts or tried to sort of refashion themselves as populist upstarts. And so, that was Britain sort of plunging itself into a prolonged revolt against the post-Cold War political consensus before the rest of the Anglo-West got there. Mm-hmm. So, what some of those leaders tried to do to varying degrees of success, and what Burnham is doing, at least over the first 3 weeks, to great success. He's actually gotten more popular since he took the top post, is to say, the old way failed you. I recognize that, but I've got a new radical way of doing politics that is going to restore your faith in the ability of government to do good for you. He's saying the old model failed you, but the endless disruption of the last 10 years hasn't worked either. Give me a shot to show you a different way. And that's a really interesting model, I think, for center or center-left politicians, because I'm not sure it's been tried, or at least tried successfully. But he's going there big time, and so far it's paying off.
Yeah, Blue?
I do, on one of your earlier points on the revolving door, just hearing you put it in that context, I do wonder if part of it is what led to the revolving door 7 people in the last few years, is that even though they tapped into that anger, that rage, that disenfranchisement, there wasn't the authenticity of experience behind it for any of those people. And I would argue Andy is the first person to lead the country whose entire life speaks to exactly the disenfranchisement that folks across the UK are feeling. Mm-hmm. It's very funny what you were saying earlier, Teresa, about, he's an overnight success. He's caught fire. I forget what celebrity said it, but that phrase of, it's amazing how many years an overnight success can be in the making. Yeah. I really like talking about his 2 losses. We were watching a podcast earlier today with him, a long form interview, 45 minutes, where they really dug into his 2 losses and his failures. I think the podcast is called How to Fail or something, which is very fun. Yeah, and to your question of how did he catch fire, I I think a lot of people underestimate how, no matter how well curated your political message is, no matter how perfect your political team is, no matter how many meetings you have where the messaging aligns with the polling, sometimes you need timing and luck on your side, no matter what. Even the absolute best campaigners, they need to have the right moment where voters look at them and they say, you know what, the issue that matters to me most, you can speak most authentically and with the most credibility to. And I think at a time when in polling, cost of living is still the top issue across the UK, Andy Burnham can speak with confidence and from experience, and it is coming from an authentic and credible place. And I think, you know, those two losses are a big part of how he became who he is today. But I also don't think he would have had such an easy go of the last year getting to 10 Downing if he hadn't been mayor for a decade and really did the work. Because I think 10 years ago, you look at around a caucus, and I'm sure there are many caucus members in that leadership race who go, I have that experience, or I could do it better. But now 10 years later, where he has successfully as a mayor navigated a pandemic, he's meaningfully brought down what they call rough sleeping and what we typically describe as homelessness here in Canada, brought down the numbers in a serious way and tackled the issue head on, and stakeholders still speak well of him. And typically when you work in that space, the way you can tell success is what the stakeholders say about you at the end of 10 years of being mayor, and they still speak very well of his commitment to the issue. And I think him as leader now, they look around the room, caucus looks around the room, stakeholders look around the room, and they're like, you know what? He can actually do it. You know, it's not just speeches, it's not just a campaign. He's done it, and now let's give him a bigger platform to do it for the entire country. And, you know, post 2 losses, being a mayor for 10 years, he's laid out a plan in his book that he released 2 years ago. You know, he has the experience of his father going through pretty serious, is it Alzheimer's or dementia? I think it's dementia, right?
I think it's Alzheimer's. I think he has
his
Alzheimer's.
His father getting Alzheimer's, coming out of the pandemic. He's had all of these experiences in the last 10 years that have given him a greater understanding of how to tackle the problems that the UK is facing, which is why his care agenda is not just, you know, something he thought of with political analysts. It's something that he experienced, and he knows how to have a real impact there. So I think there's so many things from his background that have accumulated. And, you know, listening to him talk about how in the 80s, when he graduated from Cambridge, he came home, he struggled to find a job because unlike his classmates, and like it's a world-class education, but unlike his classmates who went back to London and other places around the world, he didn't have the connections. And I think Gen Z today hears that and says, that is exactly how I feel. That is exactly the experience that I'm going through. And even if it's not the exact same circumstances, he can once again speak to it authentically and credibly and in a way where voters are like, you know what, maybe he's the real deal and maybe he does get me.
Yeah, I think we also can't discount the timing. Obviously losing twice helps with timing because you didn't win at those times and weren't screwed over by winning at those times. But I think of the whole Brexit thing was really about populism, and something I've thought about for a long time is, can you have a positive populism and can you have a progressive populism? Because I think that's something, you know, Bernie Sanders in the US has tried to do, others have tried to do in other places. And I don't think the conservatives in the UK ever tried to do a positive populism. It's obviously been very angry. It's been very race-based. It's been very, all these different things that are very negative and othering and trying to find a villain to, you know, stick the population on. I don't, you know, Corbynism tried to be a bit of a progressive response to that, but that too also has its villains. It's trying to pick certain people in society and pit people against them as well. And by the time you get to Keir Starmer, it's really, we're just sick of this. And these answers are obviously not working. And fine, there's, I like to talk about the Clone High quote where it's like, fine, whatever, this random dog is your new president. And, for people who have seen that, they'll enjoy that reference, but it's really this like, fine, whatever, whoever's left standing, you can be in charge. And actually that happens in politics more often than we like to admit. It's not so much genius staffers like us in the background. It's often just luck and timing. And I think Keir Starmer is very much, a lucky victim of that fact. And it's why his tumble happened so quickly, because I don't think people actually really ever liked him at any point. They just thought, well, he's not been this parade of clowns in the Conservative Party. So here you go, have a massive victory. But much like the Conservatives, he didn't actually have an answer to the challenges facing society. And I think the strength of Andy Burnham is he has been very philosophical about what ails the country. And to your point, Blue, he has personally experienced it. So, when you talk to Gen X people, they're always like, oh, you guys all forget our generation. It's always millennials, Gen Z, boomers, whatever. Nobody talks about Gen X. And this is a Gen X prime minister who talks about, in the 80s, struggling for work. He talks about the class divides. He talks about, he is somebody who came from a working class background, a working class community in both Manchester and Liverpool. And he went to Cambridge, and the culture shock that exists there for these families that, everyone in their whole family has always gone to Cambridge or Oxbridge. Well, I'm combining them now, but Oxford and Cambridge, of course, being the Oxbridge mafia that fills the UK government. He talks about going to those environments and just being really othered and graduating from that environment and not, you're supposed to go to Cambridge and be able to have your pick of jobs after that. And he talked about that not happening because he went back to the north of the country and those opportunities didn't come to him. He didn't have the political ties that some of his classmates had, where they suddenly had an internship at a bank or in a political office or whatever because of somebody their parents knew and all that kind of stuff. And he's talked a lot about the two Britons. And when you date that back to his age, it's really about Thatcherism and the cleavage that happened in the 1980s, where you started picking winners and losers in society. And, Britain had been struggling for a while, but Thatcher really leaned into picking winners and losers and being quite fucking brutal about it as well. Like, she was not a nice, friendly lady, as everyone knows. And that politics really took hold. Like, Thatcher, there's a quote about her. People have asked her, like, what's your greatest success in politics? And she said, Tony Blair. And that's because suddenly the progressive politics of Labour disappeared under the Blairites and everybody that followed in that party, for the most part, Corbyn accepted. And you didn't really have a progressive opponent to the conservative ideology in the UK for the last 40 years. Some would say to that ideology in Canada, in the US for the last 40 years as well. It has really been co-opted. And I think the central thesis of Andy Burnham is that the last 40 years have not worked for any of us. They're not making us any richer. They're not making us any healthier. They're not making us any happier. And we need to reject the politics that brought us to this place. Some of that is Thatcherism. Some of that is Brexit. Some of that is whatever the fuck the Conservatives have been doing for the last 10 years. But I think he has correctly actually diagnosed what the problem is. The question will be whether he can diagnose the solutions, because a lot of people, populism as well, tends to diagnose all these causes, but never really has any answers for it. But I do think, unlike all the politicians in that stream of prime ministers who came before him, he has correctly seen how they got to this point as a country. And it is going back 40 years, not to the last prime minister, but to several before them.
Well, and to the point that Blue made a minute ago as well, I think one of the interesting lessons or observations for progressives about Burnham's rise is that he never refers to himself, or at least that I have seen, as a socialist or a far left figure. It's
not ideology.
It's not ideology based at all. It's empathy based more than anything, and it's progressive policy implementation based. I think Blue mentioned ending the rough sleeping, or nearly ending rough sleeping in Manchester, bringing buses back into public control. I mean, in New York, that Mamdani's sort of tried versions of.
There's the first reference.
wasn't
we should have a counter.
10 minutes and not get him in there. But he's not leading with that as the brand. I think he's doing something else, which is to say, I tried this and this and this as mayor of Manchester. Now I want to scale some of this up,
Mhm.
or I want to scale these principles up. And it's what's interesting about that is not only that he's not referring to that in an ideological frame, but also that he's basically saying that, hey, this worked there. That's a big major city in this country, and this stuff worked. Let me do some of this nationally. And that's a bit of an interesting development, I think, in progressive politics, because so much of the anti-progressive slander in the US, I think, especially around Mamdani, has been focused on, oh, well, if he does this policy that's never really been done before, hasn't been done for the last 70 years, X, Y, Z bad is going to happen, right? If he does this pied-à-terre tax, all the rich people and the jobs they ostensibly create are going to go away. Well, that didn't happen. And so Manchester, being mayor of Manchester, sort of gives him a couple of those proof positives to say, yeah, I did this thing and it didn't bankrupt the city. In fact, it helped.
I was going to say, I think a lot of the mistakes that center or progressive politics have made is they've been really afraid to meet the right where they are. And I think it's because they misinterpret that they need to be angry and they need to be rageful, because the real root, I think, of what the right is tapping into and has been tapping into for the last few years, maybe decade, where we're talking about and seeing generational unfairness being exacerbated in many countries, arguably around the world. The real root of that is the lack of security and the unfairness and the frustration. And the easy jump to that is to think, okay, rage is the easy thing to plug into. It is easy. It is a lightning rod for people if you can give them something to be angry about and hateful towards, and you can tell them this thing or these people or this policy or this party are the reason why things are bad in your life. And it is so simple. It is so clear. The comms are relatively easy to deliver on it, if that is the route that you choose to take. And I think center and progressive parties have been afraid to see that problem and not say, no, I see the root of that problem, and I can meet it on the opposite end of that emotional spectrum with compassion and competence, and not back down from it. I think some of the most impressive stuff out of the prime minister in the last 17 days, now that he has been prime minister, has been his not backing down or being afraid to call the right out on these things and say, no, that is not the source of the problem. This is the source, and here are some solutions for it. And being unabashed in his compassion and his empathy in a way that is way more common to see in North American politics than it is to see in British politics. And it's, for many years, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, Alex. It's deference to institution, tradition, and, propriety. And it's radical for the country in a way that I think could be really successful in other places. You can be competent, you can be empathetic, you can be compassionate, and you can pull the rug out from under the right and the far right and their rage baiting if you can be competent and confident and clear in the delivery. Wasting your time with technocratic, let's talk through the history, that's not going to work. That's not going to work at a time when the platforms that are delivering us content give us such short videos, and that rage baiting is so quick and so clear. The response you give on the left also needs to be quick, clear, and unashamed. And I think that's what he's doing, and that's what's so different from recent years.
Yeah, it's interesting like that. You get into the cultural stuff very quickly whenever you have a discussion about UK politics, because you have to. But for those of you who don't understand the scale of that, if you look at the Brexit voting in London, Remain was about 60%, and in the rest of England overall, it was about 44%. So that's the north versus south, London versus non-London divide. And I think it's interesting to the point about, more positive politics, but that isn't sort of hopey changey. A lot of progressive politicians have been trying to thread that needle, and it just winds up being cringe a lot of the time. And I wrote down a line or two from one of the videos that Burnham has put out, and he's doing a lot of social media, a lot of sort of podcast style, which I find interesting as well.
And we support.
Yeah, we talked about it earlier. There is an English degree present, and this English degree is very pleased to see so much long form content.
We'll get him on the pod at some point.
Yeah, for sure. That seems likely.
So in the video, he said, the quote unquote interviewer, staffer, asked him what bringing back hope means to him. And he said, what it means to me is bringing back a sense of possibility to the country, that things aren't in an inevitable decline and that your place isn't shut out of having some good things. We can give people a sense that you can do something about the cost of living, that you can make people's life better. That's just like a nice, positive, empathetic message that sort of gets at a whole bunch of the cultural stuff in a pretty neat, cut through way. And I'm interested to see how that shakes out over the next little while.
So because I'm tasked with keeping us on time and on agenda, I do want to sort of morph that into our next question, because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. Like we're talking about him being mayor of Manchester being really important. And I had seen an interview with someone from Manchester, because of course they've just had their municipal election to replace him as well, and his party still won that election. And the conversation was basically, well, Andy has to go national because he's done things that really work, and he understands that he's hit a wall here, and to make any more progress, he has to go national. So it's hope with a plan, right? Like it's not just putting together beautiful sentences and then doing nothing with it. And I think that is actually how you combat that angry populism, right? Like you actually, one, have an agenda, because how many so-called progressive politicians do we know come in because they really just want to be a politician? They don't actually have a plan of what they want to change, let alone a plan of how to do it. So I think, and he talked about London 2012 and how there was this really hopeful moment in the country at that point. And then it all went to shit because Brexit happened right after. And ever since then, people have just felt like decline is all we have. So we have to hold on to the little we have and keep out migrants or whoever it is, because this is all we have left and it can't possibly get better. So he's definitely come in with a narrative of change actually is possible, better is possible, and we actually have a plan to do it. So this was his whole framing. We're going to talk about a circuit breaker speech. So when he first became prime minister, he came up with this circuit breaker speech, which I love the messaging of, first of all. One, because it is a working class message, actually, with its symbolism. But two, it really does suggest, the last 40 years have been the problem. So how do we change the channel on that? How do we move forward? How do we not accept that this is just our future as a nation? So he said in his first speech as prime minister, we will make this moment a circuit breaker for Britain, bringing forward the biggest changes in the last 40 years. And he essentially pledged to put together a 10-year plan to get the UK back on track. And so he's got a 10-year health plan, and he's going to be rolling out various things related to his 10-year plan as he goes forward. So the question for the panel is, and we can talk about the hope and change and agendas and all that stuff, but the question is, how successful was that speech in setting the narrative of his new government? And I guess we can sort of talk about, we're going to get more into his first 2 weeks of a rollout, but how successful was that narrative reset with him as the new prime minister? Because I don't think anyone looks at him and goes, yeah, this is still Keir Starmer's government, right? Oh, I'm the one that's supposed to talk first. So following my own notes, I think I think all of us had been following him a little bit, but as soon as I heard about this speech, my head popped up, because I was like, oh, like this is something different. This is not just, another Labour politician. He's actually like a true progressive, and it definitely made global headlines. The news made a point of pointing out that he didn't name any past prime ministers as problematic, but it's kind of lumping them all together regardless of party stripe. And it obviously goes back to Thatcher specifically, because she had a really mean politics that I think some people in Britain still love, and a lot of people in Britain understand as sort of the source of some of these issues. I do think he's done a good job of sort of saying, a pox on all our houses. Labour and Conservative politicians have been responsible for this decline, and it's on us to actually fix that. So there was a number of notes I made about just some of the pieces of the speech, because one, it's a really great speech. You can find it on the Prime Minister's website, and there's also an actual transcript of it there as well, and it's on YouTube, of course. But I think one of the things that you take away from this is that it's about bold change. And, we were just talking about how politicians are really, really hesitant to actually do anything that steps outside the normal margins of politics. And I think that's part of the problem with our politics. We're very, work around the margins, but not actually change anything real. And I think people actually actively do want bold change, and we just never give it to them. So, making this a circuit breaker moment for Britain is really like, okay, this is like a full stop and a complete turn from where we have been. And most politicians are afraid to kind of say that thing. I really like to focus on the eyes problem. So he was saying, centralized economic power privatized. So political power was centralized, economic power privatized, large parts of the country deindustrialized. So he has figured out what the problems are in society, and they are those things. But he also is talking about actually addressing the causes of that. So again, he took responsibility. This is a quote from the speech. "It requires my generation of politicians to raise our game." He said, "It's more about problem solving than point scoring," which is a really great fucking line. And he's talked a lot about taking power out of here and carrying it into every postcode in the land. Again, this is part of his municipal experience, but it's also about taking power out of Whitehall, out of London, out of, the halls that normally have power, whether it's Cambridge, whether it's, anywhere else, or the powerful and connected and wealthy gather in the UK. It's, to me, that's a really working class message right there. When he was running for leader the past 2 times, he talked about aspirational socialism, which I think is an interesting phrasing, an interesting concept. And to me, it's about barrier removal. And I have always said that's what our politics, a lot of our messaging should be about, that, because people don't really believe you when you promise something really nice and new, but they do perk up when you start talking about removing things that are in their way. And in his opening speech, he talked about life's essentials back under stronger public control to make them affordable to you again. So again, it's the socialism of making the things that you really need. We'll protect that, and it'll actually make your life more easy, more affordable. And again, this focus on activist government, he said, "We will help people to live well, building a more preventative state, investing in people's success rather than paying for failure." Fucking love rather than paying for failure. This has been my frustration for a very long time, that we don't focus on preventative care, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, other things like that, homelessness. And we end up always paying far more afterwards for not having taken those actions. And then again, I think one of the core things that this speech showed us was that he's really focused on the care agenda. So he said, "I will put care of people at the heart of everything I do." And I think when we look at his opening announcements, that care could be healthcare, but it could also be finding young people jobs. It could be opening up opportunity for people in different parts of the country. So, these are some of the core elements of the speech that I really, really liked. And it lived up to the idea of circuit breaker, because it's not what we've been seeing from other governments recently. Blue?
I think that's really great. I'm really stuck on the care agenda stuff, because I don't think it's anything that we do particularly well. And I was talking to, I'm sure you folks know, James Gennaro. He does really excellent work at the, I just blanked. I will figure out the name while we're chatting, but he does really excellent work in the space of caring. And he and I talk frequently about some solutions and what we can do as a country. And one of my favorite things in the last general in the UK, or general election, was Ed Davey, and all of the things that he said around caring. I love Ed Davey.
I was gonna say Mom Donnie is Alex's reference.
Ed Davey. I love, for so many reasons. So many of his stunts have been my phone background ever since, but mostly his work on caring. And James is at the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, and we're talking about how important it is to be intentional with it, because this is the kind of priority that if you do not center it, if you do not prioritize it, it can easily get lost, and then you lose entire years and It's brutal for people who are being cared for carers across your country. And I think it's really exciting to hear that there's a prime minister willing to tackle this. And there was a really great exchange on Twitter between Ed Davey and Peter and the prime minister. Pardon me, I'm tired, you can tell. There was a really fun exchange between the two of them where the prime minister was saying, hey, we should connect over this, which is really great. Speaking to you spoke a lot to content, Teresa. I think it's almost as important to talk about the format. If anybody hasn't watched the speech, if you work in politics, you need to watch the delivery. It's only a 7-minute speech, but the prime minister stands with no podium, no mic that I can see, and no prompter that I can see. And it looks so radically human. People line all of 10 Downing on both sides of the street, and he delivers the remarks in a way that looks like they're off the cuff because he's done enough. I know enough.
I think we actually did get confirmation that it was without prompter or anything like that. I think he probably memorized it, but yeah.
And Andy Burnham's delivery is just incredible because it looks so authentic, it looks so sincere, and when you know his backstory that it is sincere. And I think, I'm not the only sports metaphors I'm good with are baseball and hockey. I don't watch football, so I apologize, but I would say, his first 17 days and his communications on the first day and since have been fully a home run across the board. Just excellent in terms of establishing what your priorities are and how you're going to do it. To the point that we made earlier around the right really capitalizing on rage, it's just so easy and so lazy. And people keep using it because they think it's the most effective because it has worked, because the center and the left have not been good enough at doing what the prime minister is doing right now. And it's not just in UK politics, and it's not just in national politics. See this even, we could talk about the municipal race if we wanted, but too many politicians think voters want to see the rage they feel, but voters, when they are given the chance to vote for somebody who loves their city, their province, their country as much as they do, but still can articulate what the problems are, they will take that opportunity. They are hungry for that opportunity. The one thing about the prime minister is he has articulated so many times what the problems are and how he'll deal with them, but he loves the UK. He absolutely loves the city that he was mayor of, like more than anything. There's that video where he got the permission from Oasis. He says, I think like 2-3 times in the video, I love everything about Manchester. And there's something in you where you're watching it and you're like, I'm not even from there. And I'm like, I kind of want to go visit. This looks kind of great. And I think voters are hungry for more competent, capable politicians who can articulate what the problems are, but also deeply love the place where they represent. I said to you guys before we recorded this, when you watch that 10 Downing speech, you can't help but think, I would bet my life that there was hours and hours of debate about him taking off his tie and his jacket, because the only thing that could have made that speech more human was like, I'm holding my arms up here, sleeves rolled up and tie off, because it was so good and it was so human. But I know, like we said earlier, Alex, the constraints that that there are in UK politics are a little bit different than here in North America. But I'm sure we'll eventually get our sleeves rolled up prime minister.
Well, it's fun. It's funny, the whole question of authenticity is so fascinating to me in the era of populism. I mean, many words have been spilled about Trump in that respect, but similarly in the UK, I mean, one of the peculiarities of modern British politics is that its most successful populist of the last decade sounded exactly like the establishment he was campaigning against. This is Boris Johnson. He was electorally quite successful, became prime minister on a populist message. He wasn't always populist. He sort of, during Brexit, held his tongue for a while. Everyone knew he went to Eton in Oxford. Like this is the elite of the elite of the elite. He has a posh accent, and yes, he always styles himself as a bit of a Trump
would be the UK word.
Yeah, exactly. But no, everyone knew that wasn't him. But he was able to pull it off. And you know, even Nigel Farage, like he worked in finance. He was a stockbroker, I think. And but you look at those two figures, and you know, neither of them are the person they claim to relate to. But you know, Burnham comes by it a little bit more honestly. I mean, obviously he went to Cambridge and he's a career politician, but you know, it does feel different. He's able to get it across in a different way, and everything he's done and said in the manner in which he's done it over the last 3 weeks is in keeping with what comes across as a genuine authenticity. And Blue, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, at risk of being the Mamdani guy, the thing I keep saying, to everyone who I talk to about him is I think a lot of people are taking a lot of the wrong lessons from Mamdani and his rise in popularity. More than anything, I think people like him just because he seems like a normal guy who just genuinely loves New York City and that his heart's in the right place. And you put those things together and you don't get that in a lot of political candidates. And so when you have that, and when they can actually connote that just naturally, it seems really rare. And that's because it is. So, you know, Teresa and I talk a lot about this, that if, you know, every political staffer says they want authenticity, and the problem is that, you know, more often than not, the person you're working for, like, just authentically isn't the thing that you actually want people to know that they are, and that's the problem. And so the only actual antidote to that, the only durable antidote to that, is to select better candidates. And I think UK voters have done that.
We should do a segment where we like black out people's faces, change their voices, and be like, how many politicians have you worked for, and how many did you think actually had the stuff?
Exactly.
Well, that's exactly the point I wanted to talk about before we move on to the next section, because when I look at Andy Burnham, I go, it's to your point, like, I authentically believe he really cares this much, that he actually really enjoys the UK and Manchester and wherever else this much. Like, he truly loves this. He truly wants to do these things. It's not just, oh, he focus grouped this and, you know, 30% agreed and blah, blah, blah. Like, fuck, I hate that. Like, he clearly has his own mind on these issues, understands, he has a clear vision of what he wants to do. He understands who he cares about and what he thinks he can solve here and all of those things. And I know it's only 2 to 3 weeks in, and we will be disappointed later, I'm sure. But how often, even as us as politicals, like, there's the public reaction, right? And then there's the jaded political response where it's like, oh, even I feel hopeful. And how often in your life have you felt that happen? It's a handful for me, like, honestly. There's not been a lot of political candidates out there that I'm like, yes, awesome, this is the solution. And, you know, like, I really, really feel positive about him in a way that, you know, I do about Mamdani as well. And again, it's because I think, one, they're authentic. 2, they actually have a plan for what they want to do. They're not just in politics to be in politics. 3, they're enjoying themselves, which I think is, you know, I always talk about the team that has the most fun wins. Like, this is one of those things, like, you can't look like you hate the job, and you can't actually hate the job while you're doing it, because people will sense that and not vote for you because they won't think your heart's in it. And I think he is very much tapped into that. And again, because we're trying to have, like, what is the lesson to Canadian progressives? How do you think he's managed to achieve that with the speech and in the first few weeks? Because he has melted our cold dead hearts as a panel. And that is a very, very rare thing. And I think part of it is what you're talking about, Alex. Find the right fucking candidate. Don't just prop up whoever you will do. That is a key part of it. But, like, why do you think even we are, you know, Burnham heads at this point?
I mean, he's putting his money where his mouth is, right? Like, he's had a Mamdani-esque flurry of public policy announcements the first 17 days. I mean, and they've all, to the point that I think Blue made earlier, they've all been centered on affordability and empathy. You know, freezing bus fares, cutting tax on energy bills. What else have we had? A big focus on mental health supports, social care reform. And I think a big one that, again, sort of leads into the North versus South culture thing to a pretty solid degree, is a focus on skilled trades and apprenticeship trading, which I really think Canada, you know, should take note of. And you talked about banger lines, Teresa. He had this one, which I wrote down. This was in the announcement on the skilled trades. He said, "Britain will value the hard hat as much as the graduation cap."
Yeah, it's probably top 5 lines of this period for me, which is like a high bar because he's so many good ones.
Yeah. So how is he melting our cold dead hearts? It's with shit like that, and it's it's meeting the moment, and it's also, again, it's leaning way into his thing, which is actually big government in a way. Yes, there's a devolution component to it, but like, this is a big government lefty, and he's not framing himself that way, but he's doing the policy pledges that way. And it's like, that's backwards from how it's gone mostly, in the West the last 10 or 15 years.
To be very deeply nerdy, just for like 30 seconds here.
we haven't already been doing that?
Nerdier.
To our earlier analogy, it's like every staffer can name like 5 to 10 Selena Myers they've worked for, but very few can name their Bartlett. You know what I mean? And like, listen, I know the West Wing is problematic, and Veep is a whole other podcast episode we can talk about, but 100%.
Well, this is what I always say to people. Like, people want politics to be the West Wing or Parks and Rec, but it's actually just Veep, and that is very, very sad for all of us. The one thing I will say, though, is, we're talking earlier about populism and how do you counter that from a progressive lens. And I think economic populism, like a progressive economic populism and flattening economic differences, has been the answer that most have reached for. And I think he's channeling something different. And I think instead of populism, he's finding common ground, but he's coming at it from like a common angle, which is, that's a specific word choice in this context of the UK as well, given, peerages and all that kind of stuff. But he's coming at it from a place of like, what is the common person? How would they approach this? How would they care about this? It wouldn't be with, like rage and trying to like cast out their neighbor, although there was a proposal this week from one of the opposing parties to create a snitch line on your neighbors. So, there is some of that in the UK, but he is coming at it with this approach of like, what does the common person need without class in the way, without that in the way? We all care about these things. What does the common person need? And so I think instead of populism, it's like commonism, trademark that word. I think that's the difference here. It's not this angry force, but it is this connective force. It's this community force about bringing people together and working towards the common good. And to your point, Alex, that's the big government piece. It's seeing government as a tool for good. It can be passively there. It can enrich the people who sit in parliament, which is historically what they have done with it. Or it can actually move heaven and earth on behalf of its constituents. And I think that's what he's seeing it as. It's a really strong force in society that, above all other things, wealth and corporatism and all those other things that have come over the UK over the last 40 years is the primary mover and shaker in policy. He's saying, actually, no, we can push back with the full force of government to make your life better and protect you in a way that only government can. While allowing you to succeed as an individual, like giving you that breathing room. And that just feels like very common, average, everyday person to me in a way that populism doesn't really understand because it's too focused on anger. So to me, that's the sort of narrative arc that he has really leaned into and is starting to build. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Alex did mention some of the announcements, and we want to talk about, I'm calling the segment Flipping the Switch because it is about that circuit breaker moment and what that has meant. So I have rarely seen a pace like this for a new administration. We talk about the 100 days in the US. We talk about, there's a whole bunch of processes in Canada that we follow. There's stuff that happens at the municipal level, but this is a really fast pace, and people have complained that he went on vacation, but my God, I appreciate a politician who lives up to his commitments to his family that he made prior to all this happening. So that's actually a good sign to me. But we're going to do a rundown here of what he's announced since becoming prime minister. July 21st, he opened up with cutting taxes on electricity bills. July 23rd, he talked about number 10 North, which is his bid to move a lot of government programming to the north of the country and into communities across the country as well. Basically, he's setting up a northern number 10 in Manchester. Part of that, I think, is him not really wanting to leave Manchester. But part of that is also obviously trying to spread power around. We actually saw this in Ontario provincially in the Peterson days. They moved a lot of ministries to North Bay, to Thunder Bay, things like that, the various bays. They moved things out to other parts of the country, Guelph. That's what you do to sort of say, hey, not all the decisions happen in Toronto or London or wherever it might be. Same day on July 23rd, 20% business rate cut for a tax cut for pubs, clubs, and live music venues. Fucking love that policy. What a great idea. Then we have his AI task force the next day, which is my one about him. July 27th, stands shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine for as long as it takes. So again, living up to the one probably good thing that Keir Starmer ever did as prime minister. Same day, education reform, early access to technical education, skills training, and work experience and connections with employers starting at age 14. July 29th, fixing social care together. And of course, he invited the other parties, not Nigel Farage, but everybody else to participate in that process. July 30th, an $8.4 billion pound nuclear submarine investment supporting 22,000 apprenticeships. Again, this was ostensibly a defense announcement, but again, was about creating jobs for young people. July 30th, share of income tax to be given to mayors. This is, something that he's very passionate about as a former mayor, and is about devolution of powers to local politicians as opposed to just being at Parliament. And then August 5th was the latest one, and I'm sure there's others that maybe I'm even missing now, but major expansion of community mental health supports across England. I think it's like 154 or something new centers to deal with mental health. So crazy fucking agenda. He's been extremely, extremely busy. He has not waited. And again, when you're thinking of somebody who has very bold politics, this is actually the kind of pace you expect. You expect them to get down to work and start making changes immediately. And it lives up to that circuit breaker narrative because it's about a very dramatic, drastic, obvious turn in direction for the country. So this has been a whirlwind. Him becoming prime minister has been a whirlwind, but he's hit the ground running. He's tackling a number of crucial issues facing the British public. What do you think of his performance so far in the opening days of the job, vacation notwithstanding? Lou?
We've done 2 segments so far that have been ripe with optimism. So I regret to inform you, I'm going to bring in a little bit of cynicism into this segment here. And I'm going to do my best not to mess up the Prime Minister's name again. For your awareness, we are getting dangerously close to my bedtime, but not an excuse. Listen,
I actually quite like the nickname Birnbaum. I think that's cool.
I'm tired. It's fine. Listen, we are 17 days into his tenure. And so far, a lot of news releases, a lot of speeches. And granted, they are excellent news releases, speeches, op-eds. He's done more comms.
So many op-eds.
Yeah, he's done such an English major. Okay, that is the most English degree move I've ever seen in my life. New op-ed every couple of days. And listen, I love it. I think it's been excellent comms, but the next couple of months are really going to be where we can take a step back and see how effective he can be as a leader, because for somebody who is such an agent of change, he is going to face a lot of resistance. He's going to face a lot of resistance, not just in Parliament, but from the public service, who has been, business as usual. We've already seen it. There have been some story leaks. Teresa, I think you shared that with us earlier today, story leaks of folks saying public service is advising the Prime Minister not to be so blokish, quote unquote.
Yep.
And I think he's going to, as you would see in any government where your leader is expecting a lot from your public servants to deliver, there's going to be a lot of resistance too, because this kind of change is going to take a lot of work. I think what will really be the true test of his success as a leader is how he can withstand a lot of the pressure, a lot of the resistance, both within the public service, from stakeholders, from wider society. And frankly, if he's going to be able to withstand caucus, right? Because he is at his peak of support. Typically, a leader, when they are first brought in, is when their approvals are at their highest, which usually means it's only down from here. But my understanding from what we've read is that name rec is still not unanimous across the country. Like, he is not the best known entity, so there might still be room for him to go up from here. However, he will hit a ceiling, and it's usually in the early days of when you're running a government. And the question will be if his caucus can stick together and understand that their solidarity will be so crucial for their ability to execute on the agenda and once again be electorally successful in another general election.
Well, and let's remember they don't owe him their past election, right? Like, it's almost
100%.
it's almost unheard of that you see this. Like, at least with Carney, he immediately got a new mandate, and we can debate whether Burnham should go to an election as well. That's a whole hot topic right now. But I think that's a really important point, that like none of these people owe him. 90% of them voted for leader, but they don't owe him anything. So that's tricky to manage with 400 of them.
100%. Like that the larger your caucus gets, the more unwieldy it can get. So I think he's done excellent signaling at what he wants, laying out a roadmap, giving direction to the public service, giving direction to his caucus, but he's going to face a lot of resistance, I think. I think it's been great that we've seen him be more positive and looks like he wants to collaborate, like we said, with other parties, which is, I think, excellent and will help make you a little bit more weatherproof to that revolving door. But your entire country, not just your caucus and parliament, have now gotten used to, what was it, the head of lettuce? I think,
yes.
I think the prime minister has a lot that he wants to accomplish, but I'm sure there will be plenty of leaders in the country and internationally who say, give us a call in 6 months when you've been able to hold on to your seat for a little while here. I think he has the stuff to be able to do it, but it'll be very hard when the rubber hits the road here. I think one of the big challenges that progressive governments have historically run into is true progressives are excellent and they care deeply about communities, or they can be excellent in their policies and what their intentions are, but they can frequently like over consult to death, right? Like we could get into a cycle of, okay, here's all the ideas I've presented, and now I'm hearing from all these stakeholders, all these country leaders, oh, do we need to change course on everything? Or are you going to have a bit of a steel spine and be able to push forward, right? Now, he's already reversed course on one thing, the plan for the prisons. And we won't get into detail here, but all of us here have read a lot of articles on this, but needless to say, the prison and justice system is under a tremendous strain in the UK. Yeah. They are almost out of spaces for folks who are convicted within their prison system. So successive governments, this is not just Andy Burnham, have had to lay out a plan to make room in the justice system, which means releasing some inmates. And there was so much pushback from victims advocacy groups and specific victims that made a lot of headlines. He kind of pressed pause on the whole plan. He's since released, I think the op-ed came out after he pressed pause to kind of lay out why this is so necessary in an op-ed, which was very well articulated. But it makes me wonder, when he faces resistance for his other policy agenda items, which ones is he really going to see through? And is he going to be able to have that steel spine to really say this is what is necessary for the country? And are his caucus going to, give him the benefit of the doubt and work with him to deliver it, even when polling dips a little bit? I think, his big plans on devolution are great if you had a country full of mayors like Andy Burnham, right? If we were certain, if he stepped back and he's like, every mayor in this country is me, we can do this, you'd have no problem with execution. But where you get into trouble is where you download a lot of your powers that you oversee as a country to councils, and they aren't then applied equally in every single council, right? So then you can see how inequalities can really be exacerbated depending on where people live, which is exactly the opposite of what he wants to achieve. So it'll be really curious to see how the devolution agenda works out for him, because we've seen the other side of it. We were talking about this. A lot of provincial responsibilities were downloaded into municipalities many years ago here in Ontario. And, there's very different things when we talk about jurisdiction. It's really apples and oranges between Canada and the United Kingdom. But that exacerbated inequality can be very similar when we talk about which municipalities are more capable and less capable. I was listening to some analysts talk about how there's many regions that don't have full councils. What's going to happen with them? Is devolution going to be applied evenly to all municipalities of all sizes? So I'm getting too in the weeds now. I did too much reading because I have too much time on my hands. But my point is, I'm really curious to see how his plans actually take shape when the kind of rubber hits the road here and they're implemented, and how he's going to have the kind of allies both within caucus and external to it to be able to fully deliver. Sorry for the talking there.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to watch him and his advisors toe that delicate line in the first 17 days, because obviously, like we talked about, there's a lot of, big government stuff that he's talked about ushering in, but he has thrown that red meat to folks as well. What was the line here? Burnham pledges to be relentless, was the word, in curbing small boat crossings, which is boats coming from continental Europe and entering illegally.
Well, and France says it's impossible.
And France says it's impossible. So yeah, there you go. History will be the judge. But that's an interesting marker in the sand, maybe to mix a metaphor, insofar as, when we think, I think in this country, or at least in this province, about quote unquote progressive politics, very often the desire to not offend any camp supersedes any other strategic consideration. There are lots of political advisors, center and center left in this province, in the city, who would never allow that to see the light of day. The fact that it did see the light of day, I think, is instructive. Mm-hmm. But I think I'll go deeper on a point that Blue made a minute ago. What I think one of the biggest mistakes that center left parties have made over the last decade or two has been assuming that good values automatically produces good government. Mm. And I don't think voters believe that anymore. And I think it is also true that progressive politics has spent too much time talking about fairness and not enough time focusing on competence. And the big question, of course, for Burnham will be execution. He's placing a lot of faith in, I think, one or both of two things happening. One, that operationally he can manage a government, and to Blue's point, a civil service that can actually implement the type of reforms he's promising, and or that people will continue to buy his comms and his general vibe around the large scale change that he's talking about. You can do one without the other, but you're really banking, if you're Andy Burnham, that you're going to be able to do both with the scale and style of the changes that he's talking about. So we'll see what day 18 holds.
The thing I've been thinking about in terms of his approach in the first few days, I was looking at okay, what was the order of operations? What did he tackle first, of course? And he seemed very much, he's obviously been a very domestically focused politician, but he did do a number of things right out of the gate to sort of satisfy those more global pieces, and even just like the kingdom itself, if you will. So when he first became prime minister, you get calls from everybody because they're like, oh, congrats on becoming the new prime minister. So people reach out to you and you have little conversations. So he talked to the US, and then Ukraine, and then the EU, then France, NATO, European Council, Germany, all on day one, and in that order, which I thought was interesting because, again, the special relationship comes first, then, the top European protector of Ukraine comes second, then EU, because we were trying to turn the page on Brexit and maybe come back into the EU at some point, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that order was very interesting and very important. He later had a call with Carney, and this is the second piece I found interesting about his international calls. He talked to Carney and then Spain's Sanchez, who's the leader there. And with Carney, this was the quote: as fellow Everton fans, the Prime Minister said he hoped to be able to roll out the blue carpet and host Prime Minister Carney at an Everton game in the future. As a Liverpool fan, boo, but as somebody who understands football politics in both of these countries, I thought that was a really funny, cutesy way to be like, hey, we're bros. Which, when you're opening up relations with a politician, I'm sure they already know each other anyway from UK society, but when you're starting these relationships, those kinds of little details are important. And a similar readout with Sanchez said that the Prime Minister began by congratulating Spain on their brilliant win at the World Cup on Sunday night. So again, the football politics, we're just talking about the blokeism, right? And trying to get rid of that. And we were all texting each other saying, like, we hope he does not listen to that advice, because it is very effective. It's part of his charm. It's part of, again, that common person narrative he is constructing about himself and about the country. And I will come back to that in a second. But the other piece that he did was he immediately had calls with the first ministers of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland on day 2. I might have done those on day 1 before the international calls, but whatever. But he's already, in this period, just while doing all these other things, he's already visited Scotland. He's already visited Wales. He's got a visit to Northern Ireland on the books for this month. He's already said, like, referendums are not happening. We are not doing referenda at any point, but he is very much, the thing that's interesting to me is how he's getting his messaging to do multiple things. So this, this focus on a better life in every postcode, he's also extending that to these other places that perhaps, may want to succeed. So, like he has said to Scotland straight up, you're not having a referendum, but we're going to improve the economic situation in your communities across Scotland. He's talked about that with Wales. He's talked about that with Northern Ireland. So again, this is ostensibly about a local council thing that is also doing double duty with these historically fraught relationships within the kingdom. So that's all interesting to me, but obviously the domestic focus has been the main part of it. And again, I think the blokeism is like a very key part of it. I think he's had a very muscular domestic agenda so far. So, there's the circuit breaker speech, but then the power in every postcode. Like, again, he has a way with words. That English major, people say it's not important, but it actually really does help. I'm sure he has writers as well, but you don't think he's crossing things out and making it his own. He absolutely is. So I really like that framing. I like the framing of Number 10 North as the nerve center for a rewired Britain. Again, we're talking about things that, I don't know, I'm used to Australian language. Do they call them tradies in the UK? But like that sense of like apprenticeships, again, you're talking about wording and phrasing that is typically attached to the apprenticeship world as opposed to the Ivy League world, right? And the Oxbridges of the world. So again, the language he uses is very speaking to the common person and treating these worlds as equal. Something we were talking about before all this, and there's other lines I like too, but I want to focus on this Two Britons agenda because he's talked about it a bit, and he talks about, again, being a young person from Liverpool initially and Manchester. Obviously, like when you're from those two places, you're gonna love football. Like that's going to be a focus of your life, especially if you're from a working class background. And for those who don't know in Canada about the Hillsborough disaster, so this was in the late 1980s. Liverpool was in the semifinal of the FA Cup, which is, football's championship in the UK. And there was a crowd-crushing incident that actually led to the deaths of, I believe it was 97 people, something like that. And almost 1,000 people injured. There was 700-something people injured. And in the aftermath of this, and again, this is something that's been going on for a very, very long time. So the last person to die from that disaster actually died in 2021 from their injuries from that disaster. So Andy Burnham has talked about growing up in this era and then going back to Cambridge because he was like 17 or so, then 17, 18. And nobody there was talking about it because this was not their background. And, the background on this is that basically the venue had not restored, it had not gotten an upgraded approval on its safety features, so it was out of date. And then the local police had corralled people into a specific area that led to this crushing. And instead of any of those people taking responsibility for it, the football hooligans, as they're called, largely from Liverpool, were blamed for their own deaths for 30 plus years. And there was a number of different investigations about it, and people in power, whether it was the police or in the political offices, conspired together, and the press as well, conspired together to blame the victims for their own deaths. And I think this as an entry point for Andy Burnham into how society in the UK is structured is really, really instructive because, of course, he actually eventually became the minister who was responsible for creating the final investigation into this that actually led to the real truth coming out and all the collusion that was involved in this. And he had walked into Liverpool and was booed, into Anfield and was booed. And then he immediately put this together, this inquiry, and that actually led to the truth finally coming out. And, this is part of why they say don't read The Sun if you're in Liverpool, because they had on the first day after the crush happened, they said a big headline that said the truth, and it was blaming all the Liverpool fans for dying because of what was actually the authorities' fault. And it really speaks to this sense he has about UK society, that there are people in power who use power to keep themselves in power and to keep creating benefits for themselves while blaming other people. And there are a lot of people who are left out of those power structures. And he talks about this too, graduating from Cambridge, where he graduated, but because he was in the north, he didn't have the same job opportunities leaving Cambridge that his fellow students did, who had, famous parents or connected parents who could get them an internship at a bank or in parliament or whatever it was. And there's these different realities for different people in the UK. But rather than create like an angry scenario about those two things, he wants to bridge that gap. He wants to make sure that there are opportunities for everybody. And so, Alex talked about, what's the line again? Valuing the hard hat as much as the graduation at CAP. Again, that's about not saying one is better than the other, but saying they're equal and they're equally valid, and you can pursue either, and you should be able to get a good life from either of those different options that you pursue. So I think, he has a lot of these different policies that seem like they're doing one thing, but they're actually building this other narrative that it's a philosophical approach to government and society that he has really based all of his ideas and seems to be pushing on. So I hope that means he will have a bit more of a steel spine. I do think the one thing with the crime front, if you're a progressive, you have way less leeway than conservatives to be wishy-washy on those issues or to come to conclusions that people are unhappy with, because they just always think you're weak on crime, so you're going to have to do those things. But that's what I think this first flurry of policies really shows, is there's the core thing that he says he's trying to do, but there's also the undercurrent of uniting Britain so that it's no longer this Brexit divided nation. It's something where people can finally come together, hope, and dream something better.
Your point 2 seconds ago on him accomplishing the two things and Hillsborough, the two Britons, it's not just the policies, it's also the comms approach. Like, I am very hung up on the blokeism accusation from the public service, because if I could just get 2 minutes with the prime minister and give him one piece of advice, it'd be like, absolutely reject that. Because
but that's that class divide in the UK, right? Because if you're a football 100%. Fan, you're a hooligan.
100%.
And but like we saw, like even Keir Starmer's like, oh, I love football, but like, did you really believe that about? Like, maybe he does, but he doesn't really seem to have that vibe. Burnham can cross it, but like it's so psychological in the country's psyche.
Oh, 100%. And I think even when he was explaining the devolution agenda, if folks go to his Instagram or his TikTok, he does this video where he describes a bun. He's holding it in his hand, like the food.
We love the bun video.
But he describes it with like 5 different words, all of which are used in different regions of the UK to describe that exact same piece of food. And he's like, now, why would we do policy the exact same in every single region? The regions know what they need best of all. And it was so sticky and so relevant and so human that, like, man, it's okay if you lose the tie and you talk with a bun in your hands, because it is extremely relatable, and you will be rewarded on election day in a general election, because there are more folks there than ones who are concerned about the way you dress, the way you talk, and needing you to be more quote unquote proper.
And yet though you still have the so-called strategists online dumping on it, right? Because they're like, oh, this is so dumb, like, and I'm like, no, this is
just because they haven't seen it. Like it's a politics that is kind
they haven't seen it. They also haven't lived it, right? Like, they are not his audience 100%, here, right? 100%. And they don't get that.
100%.
Well, and that's the whole thing, right? The two Britons thing isn't solely or even predominantly about economic growth. It's about dignity. Right? The divide isn't the city of London versus Manchester. It's capital city versus everywhere else. Like if you think back to the fault lines in Brexit, it was really globally connected cities against the towns and places that were left behind by globalization. And so those are the two Britons that I think he's trying to knit together thematically and also from a policy standpoint. But to Blue's earlier point about put the pessimist hat on for a sec, I think that's a slippery slope in some ways, because there aren't actually only to England's. There's, global London. There are successful regional cities, Manchester being one of them, Bristol. There's the commuter belts, there's the post-industrial towns, there's rural England, there's the coastal communities. Like those are all very disparate places with disparate cultures and disparate senses of identity. And you got to be a little bit careful in telling people what camp they fall into in politics. And so that, again, that's a line he's going to have to toe pretty carefully. Obviously he's in the honeymoon period right now, but I think what's interesting about the frame on the flip side is that he's not running against London. He wants everywhere to be successful, and that's really the difference between the Brexit two Britons and the Burnham two Britons. He's running against concentration, right? Concentration of power, concentration of culture, concentration of investment, concentration of economic opportunity. It's all that's wrapped up in it.
This is where
he had a really good line in his apprenticeship and learning opportunities announcement, where he said, whether you choose construction, coding, or classics, which, I love alliteration, you'll get the skills you need and be given the respect you deserve. And I think that's really what it is. It's like, we can all come from different backgrounds, do different things, but like, we're still equally valuable to the society that we're building together. And it's not about being better or worse than each other. It's about doing what actually makes sense for ourselves and our communities, and recognizing like that's not always going to be the same thing, and that is fine. And to Blue's earlier points, like I think that's part of the devolution conversation, is it's really about doing what makes sense for where you are and who you are, right? And that
I
can
hear
get complicated.
That, and I feel traumatized by the housing arguments, right? Because I've been in like Alex, you would know better than I do, but I like every time you're in a room with consultation, they're like, this is really great, and I know we need it, but just not here.
Yeah.
And man, that applies to so many things, not just housing. And that's where you're like,
I'll give you the flip side though, because when I worked at the Ministry of Housing, and again in Ontario, this is not the UK, but when I worked at the Ministry of Housing, we created a fund called Chippy, which was essentially a homelessness program that was delivered at the community level. And the whole idea of it was, what works locally for you in solving homelessness. We're not going to get in your way. We're going to give you the funding you need to go pursue those local answers that actually make a lot of sense. But I also did the same thing with the local poverty reduction fund. It was something that said, hey, what's working locally. Let's try and expand on that where we can, which is very Andy Burnham, and, but make sure it makes sense in the local context. So I think it's about, again, respecting the people on the ground to know what works, and then giving them the opportunity to do it. Now, you made a good point earlier, which is not every town has an Andy Burnham. In Ontario's case, I would say not every town has a John Taylor who's just going to go do the things regardless of what the provincial government is saying and get the thing done. You do need really good people on the ground, and it's hard when you're focused federally to actually have your hand on the pulse of the municipal side of it. So it does require good people at all levels. And, maybe he's more hopeful than I that those people exist, but I don't know, maybe it makes sense sometimes to give people that room.
I also think this is where you can thread that needle in a really interesting way with the money, right?
Yeah.
Give them the money, but set the standards nationwide, so that no kid goes to school, goes to a doctor, or has a roof over their head that is subpar based solely on their region and where they live, right? Like,
well, and this is something I think is like, there are core issues where I think that is absolutely true. Like, it's the reason why in Canada we have the Canada Health Act, right? It's to make sure that everybody's getting a baseline level of care across the country, and that your postal code doesn't matter for that. And I'm hoping that, in his approach to devolution of powers, that he understands that as well. And it's more about giving people flexibility, but not, lowering standards or letting people get away with not doing what they should be doing, which is what we're seeing in Alberta and Canada right now, of course.
I think in terms of implementation, I think you also have to pick and choose, right? You're gonna have some issues where you're gonna have to carrot and stick in the Ontario or in the Canadian case, a municipality into pursuing a policy you want them to pursue in order to get the money that they want to get, right? Yeah. This was the model behind the Housing Accelerator Fund under Trudeau, and it was extremely successful, right? Cities had to make what the feds thought were more or less broad-based housing policy reforms in order to get the funding. And Oakville was, I think, basically the only municipality in Ontario that didn't do the thing, because they actually saw an opportunity to say, oh yeah, we don't actually want the housing, so we don't need the money either. Like, we're super happy coming and going. But every other municipality was very, very effective with every other municipality. So on some policies, they're just going to have to be a little bit heavy-handed in terms of whether or not they fund it, and on others, they're going to have to, put their money where their mouth is. And to Teresa, to your point, in those cases, it may actually be successful and maybe the smarter thing to do. But a broad brush approach, I think, isn't going to work.
So we're running long as usual because I'm a bad agenda keeper. But I do want to close with one quick question, and you don't have to go long on it, but it's the question that's sort of out there in society right now in the UK, which is, should Andy Burnham call an election and get his own mandate? Some might think it's insane because he already has so many Labour members, and why not just keep coasting with it? Some believe you actually should go get your own mandate. This was, Mark Carney's argument with his election, although he was closer to an election when he ran. What do you think? Should he call an election? Should he just get down to working and keep doing things?
Rock, paper, scissors. Alex, you want to go first or I go first?
Hard no. Hard no. Yes, I'll go first, and hard no to the answer to the question. I think it just runs like, I think it would be it's too much to say it's a fatal mistake, but I think it would be a huge betrayal of his whole general shtick right now to say, oh yeah, I'm the guy who's going to do all these things different and reframe how government works for people in this century, but I'm going to play the same political game that people have been playing for 400 years or whatever. That's just not on.
Yeah, I think 100% the same thing, because he would burn so much goodwill with voters, right? Like, what are you going to tell voters? You don't have the majority you need? You've got 400 seats. You've got exactly what you need to deliver, and everyone has unanimously backed you within your own caucus. You have no legitimate reason to go to the polls right now. And I think it would just burn a lot of goodwill, and it would go against, like you said, Alex, his entire ethos and why he's doing this. Like, use the majority that you have in front of you and get as much done as quickly as possible early in your mandate, because those polls aren't going to stay that high forever. So keep your head down, work really hard, and when people are putting pressure on you for election, tell them why. I've got work to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, give people a reason to vote for you before you ask them to, right? Like, spend some time in office, actually get the things done. I think you're right. With that many prime ministers in the rear view recently, I think it's time for them to have somebody who actually gets down to work and isn't playing games and, is doing essentially the opposite of what Nigel Farage is doing right now, which is always a good idea to do the opposite of what he's doing. So
we didn't get an opportunity to talk about Count Binface.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, maybe we'll do a whole episode on him, because you know what? Sure.
Just one more thing on this, on the policy thing. What we didn't touch on is what the reform is coming out with. You touched on it a little bit with some of their ideas with the snitch line, but they put out a policy on, they would all of the boats that try to come over, they would transport back to shore, which France has said, like I alluded to before, would violate international law. Like, right now, Labour is killing it on all fronts, and they're doing better than their opposition. So why?
They really are the only serious option right
100%.
now.
100%.
And the pundits have said that it's not so much going to be reform that's the problem during the election. The Conservatives probably will rebound, and that's where the race will be. We'll see if that happens. But yeah, I think they're pretty much the only adults at the table right now, especially with this new prime minister. So why not get to work and actually show people what a working government can do? Because they haven't seen one in probably 40 years that's actually been effective and working in their interests. So perhaps that's a good note to end on. We were trying to end a little sour and a little positive, a little mix for the future. Hopefully this was an interesting first episode. Like I said, we're going to be focusing on other spaces and places. Perhaps we'll get to US politics soon. I would like to talk about Australian politics at some point. Maybe we'll delve into Spanish and test my grade 10 Spanish training that I've had But yeah, this is hopefully a good insight into what we're going to be doing in the future on this panel, just talking about what progressives can learn from their international examples. Thanks for listening to us today, guys.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.